Hi everyone, we're just going to wait till 2 minutes past to give people time to join from previous meetings, then we'll get started. Great, okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on Friday morning. I was going to say a sunny Friday morning, but it's not particularly sunny where I am at the moment. So today's Tech Talk, we're going to be talking a little bit about governance with AI, and I guess with a little bit of a twist on it. So we often hear in our roles here at TT around how the acceleration of AI is meaning that data governance is coming to the forefront, probably more so than ever. I would say if I think back to when the kind of cloud boom happened and people were moving data to cloud, there was still less focus on data governance because it still was fairly tech heavy to be able to use those data platforming tools. Whereas now in the age of AI, it's a tool that anyone can use in any walk of life, be it in work or their personal life. And I think that's where we're elevating the focus on data governance. And as part of that, we're hearing how people can't start to experiment with AI until the fundamentals are in place. I'm sure everyone here has heard of things like garbage in, garbage out as the idea that we can't use it until we've got a really solid base. But we are in a moment where there is hype around AI and people are riding that curve, and it would be naive to delay that and risk losing people or losing that desire or potentially losing a competitive advantage that AI could give you. So today what we've tried to do is think of a topic that allows you to leverage AI, but whilst having a governance hat still on, but allowing you to move at pace still. So how can the two work together and provide you with that happy medium? So that's some of the topics we're going to go over today, and I'll run through the agenda in a moment. But first of all, I'll introduce myself and Matt. So I am Andy Bradley. I'm the strategy and adoption lead here at Telefónica Tech, and I'm joined by Matt Howe, who is our head of data science and AI. And we're going to take you through a few topics today. But before we get stuck in, we do have some housekeeping rules. So we will provide all the content from today in terms of the slide and the recording across to yourselves within 48 hours. That'll probably be early next week that will land in your inboxes. We do have Q&A features within GoToMeeting. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send those over to us and we'll either address them at the end if we have time. And if not, we'll make sure we take those away and we'll come back to you and respond to you directly in the aftermath of the session today. And all participants will be on mute throughout to allow us to get through the content. And as I say, if you want to ask any comments, feel free to use the GoToMeeting questions box that is available to you. So in terms of an agenda, we're going to run through a few things. So first of all, we're going to talk about finding the balance. So a little bit more on what I was just mentioning there at the top of the call. We'll then move into, we've labeled it as who's to blame. And the idea of that section is to consider how AI is changing accountability around data and the way that data is used and proliferated around the business. So we're going to touch on that briefly and how you can address some of the concerns that may exist around that. We'll then move into this idea of building momentum. So how can we take where we're at the moment with AI, drive that desire and start to actually make use of AI, but given the governance constraints that exist. But how do we get that momentum getting started early? Then we'll move into, I guess, a flip on that. So how can we actually use AI itself to drive better data governance rather than the other way around? So a nice pivot on that. Then Matt and I are just going to talk about a few areas that we've kind of encountered on projects or conversations with our clients, and then we'll move into the wrap up, what we're offering to attendees today in the aftermath of today's call, and also an opportunity to go through the Q&A. So finding the balance. So what do we mean by finding the balance? Well, this is, I guess, a challenge that we see a lot of people having at the moment, this idea that we want to move at pace, we want to leverage all the power that we see and hear about with AI and the transformative nature that it has to our industry. But there is a healthy tension between that experimentation and that kind of desire side of things, all the way through into the having the heavily governed estate on the other. If I take that first example there, this is where you have an organization that is running forwards with AI. And what we're not suggesting is that that is a bad thing, but there is a way to control that. The reason that that's relevant is, for argument's sake, you have a use case that you've run through in kind of an innovation type environment. If you've not considered governance at any point in that process, you drive an output that you feel is going to add value in your organization, and you then try and retrospectively apply the governance. You may dilute the outcome that you had previously saw, or you may have overpromised or overcommitted to something that actually isn't feasible given the constraints that you have within your organization, be that from a governance point of view, be that from a regulatory point of view. Having that governance in from the outset or as a wraparound to what you're trying to do means that you're not in a position where you potentially take forward ideas that actually aren't feasible in the wider scheme of things. On the flip side of it, the whole idea of, well, we need to get our estate in a suitably governed position before we're able to start that experimentation piece risks getting left behind. So as I said, with AI, if we think back even just 18 months at the state of Gen AI and the models that were in production, there is an exponential increase in capability that's happened since kind of the advent of Gen AI, maybe 18 months to 2 years ago. So if you are to delay your innovation and your use of AI, you do risk your competitive advantage being eaten into, because others will be taking advantage of everything that AI has to offer. So what we're suggesting is that there is that tension, there is that happy medium that sits between the two. And that's what we want to talk to you about today, is how do we get to a place where you have confidence in the AI outputs that you're delivering and that they're delivered in a governed way, in a suitable way that allows your organization to actually reap the benefits of that particular solution. So into kind of this context of who's to blame. So Matt and I were speaking at a recent event that we hosted at Telefónica, and there may be people on the call who were with us, where we were talking about some of these topics. And I mentioned how, when I think about how data governance works, I always find that it only becomes relevant at the point where a difficult decision's required, and how people then react in those circumstances, less so the creation of the policies. It's more when people actually need to call on those policies and make a decision. The idea of this part of the talk is to then position this around kind of the AI narrative. So we have an example here on screen of a bank, and if I give you kind of a bit of detail on the circumstances. So 8 weeks after launching a claims agent into their organization, they identified, or it was made apparent to them, that 3,000 claims have been declined across a 48-hour period due to adjusted risk thresholds. Now, on a deeper dive into that, the agent had been configured, with a certain level of risk that was appropriate for the business. But that agent had then tried to optimize itself so that that risk algorithm was continually altering, which then meant that 3,000 claims were declined. And the biggest challenge for this organization was that that was made, was kind of flagged to them by the media. It wasn't something that was identified internally. The important thing to call out on this example is that went through all the appropriate governance boards and it was approved by all appropriate governance boards. It was tested and it was validated that it worked as intended, and then it was pushed live. So it's difficult to argue with the process that's pushed that live. And we asked the question in the session this week of who would be to blame in that circumstance. And we had a kind of a show of hands around the room on who they felt would be responsible. Would it be the CEO who is acting as the executive sponsor for that program? Would it be the tech lead, so the person who kind of drove forward the requirements and signed off those requirements? Is it that governance board who had signed it off and said that it was all okay? The data science lead who built the output? Or would it even go all the way back to the vendor? So if this was built, let's say with Copilot, for example, would it be a Microsoft issue that you would blame? And it was a very split room on who voted for what. And the reason for that is it's really, really difficult to identify who carries the responsibility when it is an external force, if you like, when it is an agent. Now, if I said that this was built by Dave in the data science team, and I asked you then to say, well, who do you think is responsible for the issues? I think we'd all have a very similar answer. And I think it's very, very easy to attribute blame when it's to an individual. So kind of one of the driving factors that I think around the governance conversation with AI is who's responsible and who's accountable for the outputs that AI delivers. We see a lot at the moment around when people ask questions of Gen AI, there's almost a blind belief in the output that you get from that Gen AI tool, and very little is asked around questioning. And it's a topic that Matt spoke really well on this week as well, is that you need to question what AI gives you. And that's really, really important as we kind of progress down this AI journey. And one of the things that we've seen at Telefónica is this kind of behavioral shift in kind of three key areas. So the first being that accountability diffusion. So going back to that previous example, when AI is making decisions in the organization, where does that responsibility sit for those decisions? It's difficult, and it's an element that I think is at the moment being quite heavily overlooked. The second area there is around that authority displacement. So whose judgment is appropriate to override a model? If you've got a agent that's programmed based on 20,000 expert analysts versus your one analyst in your team, it's very, very difficult to have that conversation, because do you trust the one individual in your business, or do you take the output that's been provided based on the experience of 20,000 others? It's a difficult conversation to have. And then the final piece is around this identity threat piece. Now, there's a couple of layers to this. So I think the first being, are you trusting the system more than me? So is there therefore my role threatened, or is my role altered as a result of that? But also, I think the narrative that's coming out of a lot of these vendors is kind of driving some of this. So again, if I think back to earlier this week at Microsoft AI Tour, if anyone was there, they had a use case that they presented for Barclays Bank. Barclays Bank have implemented Copilot, and the stat that they provided was that 1 million hours had been saved by the implementation of Copilot. So they're driving the efficiency message. Now the question becomes, what have they done with those 1 million hours? So how has that time saving been driven back into the business? So did they then allow those people to consider new process? Has that driven increased profitability within the organization because people have been freed up for different activities? They didn't lead with that message. So the big vendors are leading with the message around efficiency, and that's only going to drive this fear that exists around AI replacing people. So again, when you then couple that with the governance conversation, it actually becomes quite a difficult sell into your organization. So that momentum shift that we're seeing how do we control that? How do we provide an element of ownership? Well, we see it as I guess, an equation, and it's a kind of a three-part equation. First one being trust. So people need to trust the output. People need to limit the overreactions that can happen as a result of what AI provides us, um, the cost efficiencies, the time savings, the drive to continue to iterate. We need to have an element of trust in the output. We have to trust the process. We have to trust the people in our organization to use that output appropriately. The second part is that clarity piece. So it's that definition of who owns failure. So when anything happens with AI, we know who is responsible for correcting that or making an executive decision on what the actual output should be, or the decision that we take as a result of the output that's provided. And the final piece that we've labeled as agency, but effectively this is a phrase that we're hearing more and more now around AI, and it's this concept of humans in the loop. So it's making sure that people are aware of what's happening, that people are driving forward the agenda that's pushed with AI. And I'm seeing a lot now around this human plus organization, in that AI is there to augment what we do at the moment. It's not there to replace. So it's having that narrative and deriving that narrative within the organization. The AI is moving responsibility, but what it is not doing is replacing responsibility and not removing humans from the process completely. I think that's really, really important. And there is an assumption that governance is that this is actually a governance problem, that we need to put more control in it. We need more sign-offs in the process. We need to document more heavily what's coming out of these agents and these tools. But actually, that level of governance just amplifies the behavioral ambiguity, because it will slow things down. It causes programs to stall. It causes leaders to ask more questions, and therefore you lose that momentum that you were hoping to gain from driving forward with your AI initiatives. So I think there's a lot for us as professionals to consider in that space, and try and drive that idea that, you know, what, AI is there to support us. It's not there to replace. It's not there to get rid of people necessarily. It's there to drive better cognitive outputs from people, and potentially replace some of the menial task work that takes you away from doing the value add stuff. And we need to recognize that, and you know, maintain that momentum that we have through the use of AI. And that's a really nice segue into Matt's piece on momentum for AI. So I'll hand over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Andy. Morning, everyone. So yeah, I mean, Andy has really nicely outlined some of the key kind of considerations and some of the key things we need to be thinking about when we're looking at that kind of AI adoption. And there's some really kind of key decisions, you know, mixed up in that kind of conversation that need to be made along that process. And I'm sure those will all kind of look a little bit different for the different types of organizations we might have on here today. What I wanted to kind of do was then take a bit of a practical spin on this and think about, well, what are actually some of the options that we have available to us that can help us kind of break out of this cycle of, you know, garbage in, garbage out? Because whilst that kind of maxim does hold true in a lot of scenarios, and there definitely is some strength to that, it doesn't offer a lot of flexibility. It doesn't really give anyone a route forward. It just kind of puts the brakes on and kind of stops that momentum. So what I kind of wanted to talk about is a little bit of some of the anecdotal things that we've seen out in the field, where people are able to kind of build momentum in a way that is controlled and it is safe, but it isn't reliant on an expensive and kind of wide-arching governance program to kind of enable that. So what I'll do is I'll kind of talk through a few different ideas that I think, you know, can potentially support those kind of use cases. So the first thing here is talking about kind of that kind of co-pilot style productivity, and anyone that is kind of familiar with the Microsoft ecosystem will be aware of kind of their drive to kind of utilize co-pilots and empower, you know, every employee with a co-pilot to kind of help them with their work. And I think this is a really good kind of entry point to AI. You know, it focuses on things like document generation, kind of summarization, you know, really driving that efficiency for kind of quite common everyday tasks that kind of employees and knowledge workers are doing. The other nice thing, of course, is that these are rooted into the applications that we use. You know, if you're very often in Word, maybe you work with documents or things like legal contracts very often, you know, you've got a co-pilot there that can specifically help you with the task at hand and understand the content that you're looking at. Similarly, if you're, you know, someone like me who ends up building a lot of PowerPoint decks, probably more than I would choose to, but having a co-pilot there to help you with some of those ideas and help you with some of those kind of design and creative thinking ideas can be really, really helpful and effective when you're looking to kind of just get those things out the door. They also have kind of quite a low reliability on existing data and pulling in a number of different things. Very often we're working on what is in front of us. We don't necessarily need to pull in lots of other aspects that may be behind some sort of governance layer, or maybe slightly more risky data that we're not quite sure whether that's accurate or whether that's going to actually be useful in our AI use case. We're typically working on something that's right in front of us. I think the other key thing to say about this is that there are opportunities within the kind of co-pilot style configuration to kind of enable the in-app experiences without enabling kind of wide-ranging access to all of the data to Copilot. I think that's a really common and a really fair fear that a lot of organizations have, that we turn on Copilot and all of a sudden people can just go and look up the CEO's salary because it's in a document in an HR SharePoint somewhere. So just to kind of make that point really clear, we can enable those in-app experiences that users can have that benefit without enabling a kind of a full and deep penetrating kind of access to AI across all of our organizational data. So that's just something to consider about that whole experience. Next slide, please, Andy. So the other thing is then kind of breaking out of just kind of personal productivity and potentially looking more at like the things that your business do, the kind of the operations that your business do, or the kind of the processes that kind of see you through the kind of the day-to-day running of your organization, and looking at these kind of different use cases. So, a very common, use case that we see a lot is kind of basic document intelligence. And that can take a number of different forms. That can be things like, can I just ask some questions of this documentation? Can I go and find that content more quickly? Or can I do things like tagging it, adding metadata, classifying these documents into different buckets so I can better kind of structure my, my SharePoint directories or my kind of file structures and that kind of thing. And also things like, looking at review data, for example, or other kind of like input from kind of the external world and saying, can we extract the key themes from this information and get that? So I think this is quite a good approach because we can actually kind of leverage a lot of these kind of AI systems against that data. It doesn't necessarily need that inherent structure to operate well. We're almost asking it to do a kind of a semi-supervised process. We're kind of saying, look, you kind of go and look at this data. It might be a little bit all over the place. We don't know exactly what's contained in these documents, but the AI can go and figure it out and safely report back its findings. We can then make decisions about whether we use those, whether we use the thematic classifications that that agent might have come up with, whether we do take on board that kind of classification and that metadata. But the agent can actually really effectively kind of automate that kind of fact gathering process, if you like, that kind of information gathering across things like SharePoint and other repositories. So that we actually have all that information right in front of us. And obviously this has a relatively low reliability on that existing metadata or directory structure. We can essentially put this to work across what we have in place and then kind of reap the rewards of that. So even if there aren't things like stewardship in place and kind of that governance around how data is structured, we can still utilize AI to actually really effectively understand kind of what is in those different data sets and in those different document structures. The other thing, of course, is kind of removing the problem or shifting the problem slightly. So rather than kind of focusing on our internal data sets, which, as we've kind of talked about, maybe you don't have the sort of the time or the inclination to go through that rigorous kind of long-term governance process. We can also look at, well, what can we do with third-party data or external data, which may be better governed or is at least looked after by other organizations, So there is that kind of inherent benefit that it's not necessarily all operating on our data. We can pull it from an external source. So in these scenarios, we might be looking at things like just getting data from APIs. There's many different APIs to do many different things, from scraping news articles and building intelligent summaries about your customers or about how your organization might appear in the press or in stories, for example. Many software as a service providers and others have model context protocol APIs. So these are specifically built APIs for agentic processes. So very commonly, if you've got, for example, a CRM system, there will be an MCP server available that allow an agentic agent to go in and get data from that. And that data is all kind of governed and looked after essentially and provided by that third party. So that MCP server can give you a really nice route in to kind of get that data without having to worry about sorting everything else out on your side. And of course, there are things like web scraping available, pulling web pages, all these things that we can pull into an agentic process to kind of get that data to something that we can then use. So again, the focus is really on less kind of reliance on our organizational data to be governed and to be really looked after, but we can actually go out and fetch that data from third parties, from external sources, and use that to come up with some really, really important and kind of impactful use cases, which I'll touch on in just a minute. Thanks. Next slide, Andy. So the kind of the last kind of approach I'll talk about here before talking about some sort of actual use cases that we can apply to kind of these kind of ways of thinking is really looking at qualitative analytics. Now, we all know that large language models and kind of AI at large in today's day is really, really great at working against natural language. We've all seen the kind of capabilities to generate content, intelligently summarize, all that kind of really great kind of natural language stuff. We also know that it's not really very good without a lot of help and effort at doing kind of quantitative analysis, summarizing spreadsheets or kind of doing mathematical analysis is not really what it's kind of designed for. But these kind of tasks where we want to give it some data, maybe we want to throw in a whole bunch of kind of review data about some of our products or some of our services, or things like commercial summaries about some of our customers or competitors, we can pass that into an agentic process or a large language model, and it will do a fantastic job of summarizing that, and then even distilling out some of that quantitative information for us to then report back to on a dashboard, or pull out the number of times that certain themes or certain kind of sentiments crop up within that data. So again, we can have sort of quite a little amount of reliance on our kind of organizational to be governed and AI ready essentially. But by giving this kind of agent that information, they can very quickly and effectively kind of sweep through that data and pull out some of those really, really key insights from a qualitative perspective that can actually be really, really impactful to an organization. Thanks, Andy. So what I'll touch on now is just a few kind of actual use cases. That's kind of outlined some of the different approaches that we might take to kind of enable AI where governance is maybe something that is a slightly longer running program. These are some of the use cases that we could look at. So from a Copilot style productivity type aspect, we can think about things like summarizing documents in Word, helping with building Excel formulas for those that are maybe not so kind of literate with Excel and all the things that you can do in that. I talked about PowerPoint slide generation, obviously. And if you've got kind of a Copilot chat enabled experience inside of your organization, even if that's not able to query against your direct documents because you don't feel the data behind that is kind of ready for that kind of analysis, we can still open it up for that kind of AI query, AI research. And the really important thing here is that if we're not doing that, there's a high likelihood that people are going to fall back into that kind of shadow AI approach where they're going to go on to things like external AI providers like the ChatGPTs of the world, or everyone now sees there's things like AI built into WhatsApp on your phone, for example. So AI is literally everywhere, and if we're not offering that option to our employees, then people will go and find it elsewhere. So by providing a kind of a governed approach to Copilot that is safely within the bounds of your organization, you're still giving them that benefit, but you're not necessarily opening up all the keys to the kingdom. So there's some really interesting use cases in there. From that kind of document intelligence system, obviously we can look at classifying documents. So even just as simple as applying basic kind of document types, document classifications, what sort of format does this document belong to? What part of the organization kind of owns and manages this document? All of these things can kind of be figured out by an AI and reported back to an IT department or a kind of a document management department that can then help to then understand what is going on and how they might kind of tackle that issue. Other things, of course, many organizations have kind of documents that have maybe come in through legacy processes or are scanned in documents, scanned in images. So OCR is a fantastic way of kind of getting that information in a machine readable format, and AI can really help to then enrich that. So more than just recognizing text and pulling that information out, but actually doing much more intelligent things about understanding what is in images, understanding what is in diagrams, for example, even being able to detect things like checkboxes and key value pairs. So not just extracting just basic plain text, but actually having a fuller understanding of what is in those documents. And that is something that AI can just do over information as it's kind of passed in. Of course, extracting things like metadata, so enriching things like document libraries with that metadata, whether that be, again, tagging the department, tagging the language that's used, all that kind of stuff can be really effective. And the last thing to say as well, that if we're looking to start establishing a better handle on our data, then as we are passing documents through these processes that are being driven by an agent or being driven by kind of an AI system, we can also start to populate knowledge bases, and that can then also help us get a handle on that data and look at how it should be governed going forwards without having to kind of repeat that process over and over again. We'll have that information saved for our benefit later. From an external data systems perspective, so We've spoken to a number of customers about just kind of fetching and summarizing, relevant news articles, relevant stories, things that, are relevant to us, whether that be about our industry and our sector. Maybe they mention us specifically, maybe they're talking about competitors. All of this information kind of lives openly on the internet, as we all know. So there's a number of options that we can use to go and fetch that information and have an enriched and kind of augmented understanding of our perception in the market, just purely through kind of turning on an AI system that can get that data for us, intelligently summarize it, and then drop that into our inbox or ping us a little Teams message whenever a new kind of article crops up. So again, some really impactful use cases, all focusing on that external data. Things like integrating live weather, travel data, again, really, really common things, particularly in things like logistics and manufacturing, where we need to know, these kind of things are on almost a real-time setting. So integrating that information into other agentic workflows can be really impactful. And as I mentioned earlier on, kind of integrating with some of those MCP servers. And again, to mention the AI tour, as Andy did earlier, one of the things that we're really seeing is there is a huge drive to kind of have these MCPs available so that when we are ready to start building our agents as an organization, we've already got the kind of out-of-the-box connectors. We've already got all the tools that our agents are going to need to talk to our systems or talk to our third-party providers. So thinking about how MCP can work for you and you can kind of get that information that you need is a really good kind of starting point when you're looking at kind of external data that maybe doesn't live directly within the organization. The last thing here, so again, qualitative analytics. So thinking about how we can extract sentiment data from reviews, for example. How can we extract insights from customer summaries, or looking at our website and giving our sales sales team a better understanding of what that customer is doing, where they've been mentioned, what kind of momentum are they kind of building, and then we can have a better conversation with our customer about how we might be able to support them. So building those kind of insightful summaries that salespeople can use when they're kind of having those next conversations. And also kind of thematic analysis, so understanding what is actually the key content of this, what are the key things that are kind of being brought forward in this particular article or this document, and so that we've kind of got that insight that we can then store and review going forwards. Thanks, Andy. So the other thing that kind of Andy talked about in the agenda at the start there was kind of how do we then sort of almost flip this on its head. So we've kind of been talking a lot about why obviously governance is important, and some of the kind of the mindsets that we need to take when we're thinking about applying that kind of governance across an AI system, for example. We've then kind of looked at, well, okay, practically speaking, what are the things that we might be able to do? What use cases might be actually relevant and impactful for my business, where we don't have to undergo a kind of a lengthy and kind of time-consuming governance approach. But this is now thinking about, well, actually, where can we use AI as part of that kind of governance approach to really help support that? And there's a number of different key things, I think, where AI can actually be a really impactful player to support organizations develop their data governance in a really, kind of impactful way. So first thing I'll touch on is kind of data tagging, and this kind of leans into some of those kind of practical things I was just talking about. So using AI to kind of parse through our documents and understand what is in there and then tag that information gives us a much better experience when we're looking to kind of understand where that data lives, who should be owning it, who should be stewarding that data. From a master data management perspective, it allows us to understand what kind of key entities, what concepts does this data represent, and how do we join that to other kind of similar concepts that might be at other parts of the organization. In particular, when we start to relate these things to other kind of technology choices, things like Microsoft Purview, which do kind of start to give us that sort of suite of tools that we can start to kind of get a handle on data governance, having that kind of tagging approach already established and kind of in operation really helps when we're trying to kind of set up those different kind of tools and those different enablers for things like data governance. Duplicate detection is another fantastic one. So anyone that's kind of from a more maybe data kind of development background will have definitely kind of had experiences where we're getting some fairly wonky looking numbers on a report. People are querying the accuracy of some of our data. They're starting to kind of deplete that trust they might have in kind of some of the analytics that we're showing. And typically speaking, that can be routed back to some level of duplicates. Maybe there's something going on in that data where some of the master data management hasn't quite held strong, and we've kind of got two customers representing the same one, for example. And again, here AI can be really effective at outlining and kind of looking at those customers and whether that's those records, and it's kind of detecting duplicates. Whether that's doing things like fuzzy matching logic or understanding different content and using those kind of more qualitative understanding capabilities to kind of detect that, can be a really effective engine to help us kind of weed out those duplicates and understand what's going on there. Of course, coming from more like a kind of classical machine learning kind of data science approaches, things like outlier and anomaly detection. So working out where we might have those kind of really kind of crazy values in our data that are actually skewing the entire data set and making that a very untrusted source of data. So by using those kind of algorithms, we can actually detect that kind of those kind of outliers across that data and give us a better understanding of, you know, what is actually the kind of the shape and the kind of the style of this data, and how do we need to handle that. But also, again, we can use the sort of more agentic and kind of large language model styles of AI, which can then obviously read content maybe in our databases, maybe in our CRM systems, and kind of work out where we might have very good pockets of customer descriptions, or you know, very good pockets of data, but also those that are maybe slightly lacking or not really driving forward, you know, the kind of the objectives of that organization from the way they're describing some of those kind of records. There's a number of different tools available for kind of AI-enabled PII detection. And obviously, this is one of those key risks that when people kind of talk about data governance and why they need a data governance, it's because they're kind of nervous around, we don't know where the PII is. We don't necessarily know if we're going to have some sort of leakage that is going to leak some PII or some sensitive information, because we don't know where all it is. We don't know where all those little fires are burning that could potentially burn us down the line. And again, this is where AI can give you that slightly more automated yet intelligent approach to kind of detecting that PII, and also kind of flagging what the type of that PII is. What information does this represent? How best should we redact this or mask it or anonymize it? What should be our approach in that kind of setting? So using AI as that kind of autonomous system to help detect that and give you that confidence in that information as to where those things are is really effective. And kind of the last thing I'll talk about here is kind of metadata enrichment. So again, when we're thinking about sort of setting up these kind of governance systems, the more we know about that data, the more and the better we can kind of handle it and approach that kind of governance setup. And very often these governance systems, you know, they rely on that metadata to be able to give them the kind of the quality of life for users that are actually going to be using and operating those systems. So, you know, taking that kind of approach where we're looking at how AI can really help data governance by looking at that data and then expanding on it, giving a better description, making it more clear what this data represents, or what a summary of that content might be, or for example, why might you use this table? What kind of attributes does this table have inside of it, for example? Can be really, really effective ways of kind of building up the understanding of that data, and that helps to enable your kind of data governance program. So Andy, I think we've probably done enough talking between us. I think we've got kind of a few topics that we would like to discuss. So we're going to move into sort of more of an open form discussion at this point. We've got a few questions that we'll kind of walk through, but again, just to call out, obviously, if there are questions from the audience, the Q&A is there, so please do use that if any things that we've kind of discussed so far have triggered any thoughts or questions that people might want to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And I've heard that talk a few times now, and it's always fascinating. So thank you. That was awesome. And I think some of the stuff we've spoken about, it's interesting to see how that kind of becomes reality in an organization. So when you're working with clients, are you seeing that some of these things are happening through kind of formal program deployments, or is this kind of a more informal delivery mechanism that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a solid mix, but I'd say there's probably more of a leaning to kind of slightly informal, slightly more experimental programs where people are looking at, you know, typically I think the nature of these kind of use cases is they crop up in different areas of the business. When we think about governance, we tend to think of it, I think, as kind of an overarching kind of organization-led kind of mechanism, but actually some of the different use cases that we're looking at are much more kind of intrinsic to a particular business department or particular challenge they might have. So what we've seen is kind of particular success where we're able to leverage things like Microsoft funding to kind of have a quick enable kind of experiment or kind of feasibility analysis. And that can actually be, so it kind of comes across as quite informal, but it's able to kind of unlock that experimentation in quite a safe and kind of constrained way, quite scope limited. You know, we're very cautious about what we're actually looking at, but they're still able to get to that point where, okay, we can prove that on our data, this works, and with a bit of expansion, or, you know, now we need to kind of link in with the kind of the governance team or that kind of particular delivery program to make sure we're kind of tying into that, but they've been able to kind of get their answers. They've been able to build that momentum. And also, of course, that can be used as a positive story across other areas of the business. So they can then look at, well, where else can we have these little kind of experiments and feasibility pieces? So I think there is a kind of a slightly informal kind of approach to that, which I think works to help enable that experimentation. But I think the important thing is that we're always aware that at some point we need to tie this back. We can't always just go all guns blazing and get all the way to the kind of the finish line without looping in that governance. So there always will be that kind of attachment and that kind of tie-in at some point down the line.
Yeah, I think, do you know what? I think that's really important because I think the word experimentation can sometimes raise alarm bells, but the reality of it is that experimentation is a good thing. But I would say that the risk comes from when that experimentation is happening almost behind closed doors. So you mentioned earlier about the kind of concept of shadow AI. And look, regardless of what we say, that's definitely happening. So in organizations, there will be some form of shadow AI that is taking place. People will be using external tools, like you say, things like ChatGPT, but giving people the runway to feel that they're capable of experimenting in a moderately controlled way. And this kind of, the fail fast methodology around let's try things, and if it doesn't work, then that's fine. We'll just move on to the next thing. That's really, really important. I would say that the key really with the governance piece is that as you're working through that experimentation, that if there are things that are raising alarm bells around what that experiment is leading towards, that activity is attacked early from a governance point of view, and that you address it as early as possible, and you don't wait for, I guess, the perfect output or a perfect underlying data set or a perfect set of principles, in that you are able to ask questions and challenge at the point where things are starting to take shape. Because again, that whole fail fast methodology isn't just about it doesn't achieve the right outcome. It's also about addressing when that doesn't meet a need from a governance perspective as well. That's could potentially lead to challenges further on down the line. We've spoken a little bit as well about, well, we've mentioned it a few times now actually, the kind of the garbage in, garbage out methodology, and how you shouldn't be putting data in until it's good enough to use. I guess the question is, how do we recognize when data is good enough to use? Is there a particular trigger point, or is there anything that we need to be aware of as professionals, and when we can start to use our data?
Yeah, I mean, this is my personal kind of biggest bugbear with the garbage in, garbage out. It offers no guidance of how to clear up the garbage, if we're sticking with that kind of analogy, but also no sense of, well, when does that journey end then, or if not end, at least at what point do we get to a threshold where we can say, okay, we're sufficiently happy with that data to move forward? It's too much of a kind of blunt instrument. So I think the thing is, obviously, like many answers in IT, it does to some degree depend. I think the key thing is to kind of have the ability to kind of look at the different use cases, the different things that are going to be impactful for your organization, and really understand, what we need from the data in order to enable that particular use case. I mean, things I'll say, like if you're looking at doing some sort of machine learning to look at things like customer churn, for example, is a very common one. Things like sales forecasting, things like stock and demand forecasting. Those kind of use cases do need high quality and quite, a decent volume of data to enable them, because we need that data to be able to make accurate and trustworthy predictions. And without that, the model will have nothing to, understand what reality looks like. It will have nothing to understand, how to make an accurate prediction, because it won't have enough of that accurate data to kind of build its understanding. So those kinds of things will obviously fall down straight away. And I think that is where that kind of garbage in, garbage out idea comes from. Because if your data is full of anomalies or full of just data that doesn't actually represent, the real and kind of world at large that it's going to be kind of predicting against, you are going to see a lot of very poor predictions. But I think when we think about things like unstructured data and looking at things like some of the things that large language models and the sort of modern day way that we think of AI now, there are lots of opportunities where the data doesn't need to be, really, really pristine. If you think about AI itself, a lot of these large language models are trained on, the internet. They're trained on a very wide-ranging amount of data that is obviously not well governed and not well structured in all cases, and not well looked after. And that's what kind of gives LLMs and their kind of that agentic AI that capability to reason so well over them. I think some of the key things that we see is that where organizations are looking at something like retrieval augmented generation, so they want to be able to have an AI that operates specifically over their data, they'll see that there are pockets of data that they have where one department might maintain their information really nicely. They might look after it. They might add metadata. They might give their documents good structure. And other departments won't, for example. And so those kind of different things kind of can really help what kind of effectiveness you get from an AI system. But the way that we typically approach this is we kind of can look at different data, and then through that kind of testing and benchmarking approach, you can very quickly see that as we start asking questions about this particular domain, let's say finance, we get some really good responses and some really good results. The agentic system seems to really understand our finance processes. But when I ask it about my HR policies, my paternity leave policy, for example, I'm not getting very good accuracy. I'm not getting the information I need. So we can quite quickly detect where that sort of lower quality of kind of data is, and kind of quite quickly find those pockets that need to be improved. And then obviously start to kind of cross-pollinate. Well, what did finance do to get their policy information into such a good point, a good state? And how do we apply some of that back to HR in that example? So yeah, so I definitely think, yeah, there are obviously use cases where data is critical, and anything that's kind of regulated or relies on policy information, for example, does need to be of sufficient quality. But there are, and hopefully as I've outlined earlier on, there are a number of different use cases, I think, across kind of unstructured data that I think the data doesn't need to be the most quality, the cleanest it's ever been. I mean, for yourself, Andy, I'd love to get a thought of kind of almost the other way around of that question from a governance perspective. What do you think really does need to be in place? Before what are if there are any, what are the kind of like absolute must-haves before you start to kind of do any kind of AI experimentation?
So I guess we rather than coming at kind of from that governance angle, it's almost a common sense approach. So when you were saying, Matt, about you've got good data, let's say we've got good data in finance, for example, would you then ask somebody who works in IT a question about the finance data, or would you ask somebody in finance who would have a level of context about that data? You go to finance, right? So the whole idea of understanding access to that information, particularly in the age of Gen AI, where regardless of the question you ask, the AI will give you an answer, right? So even if your question is poorly framed or you don't ask the right question, you always face a challenge around what the output is likely to be. And I mentioned earlier that there is a perception at the moment that whatever the output gives you from a Gen AI tool, it's accurate. So no one really challenges the output. So access control to data is really, really important. And you can control that with things like Copilot. You can provide people the access to stuff that's relevant. So I think that's really, really important. The next bit I think then is around understanding of why you're using an AI tool for whatever the intention is. So coming back to kind of the whole concept of garbage in, garbage out. I apologize to everyone that we keep repeating it, but when we talk about that idea, it's a case of understanding, well, what quality does the quality of the data impact the question that I'm asking? So if it's about how many inquiries we had, if we're confident that we've captured all the inquiries, but actually the detail of the inquiries is wrong, it's still valid data. So if you can understand why you're doing what you're doing, the governance can then follow on based on what the intended use case is. So I think that's a really, really important consideration as part of that. Accountability. So if I come back to what I was talking about at the start, the whole who to blame idea, if you've driven an accountability, not just of the AI output, but also of the data itself. So we talk very heavily in data governance around this concept of data ownership and data stewardship. So when there is issues with data quality, where there is maybe a lack of understanding of context, if you've got named individuals who understand that information, who are accountable for it, that accountability drives improvements in data quality and better data governance if they have an inherent responsibility for that data. And I guess the one thing I would say is maybe a true data governance-y type requirement, so more of a control, I'd say is around that sensitive data piece. So we had an example where we were working with an organization that turned Copilot on, and one of the first questions that was asked of the Copilot was, how much does our CEO earn? And it was able to scan all the systems, and it returned a really quite detailed breakdown of the remuneration package of that CEO. As you can imagine, the chatbot got turned off fairly quickly after that. But it's the idea that we need to understand what exists within our estate before we're able to then understand what the use of AI could be. Another example is where we've seen organizations where they've turned on kind of AI capabilities across a cleansed data set. So this is a really good quality data set, but we gave or the access was given to the AI tooling to a CFO. So this is a finance example. The CFO had access to AI tooling, started asking questions of the data, and then was interrogating his staff on the outputs that he was getting from the AI. And he was saying, well, why is it telling me this? And why is our data in this particular shape? But his team hadn't been armed with the same capability. So they were struggling to answer the questions that they were getting. So it was causing internal tension. So, there's a definite consideration for use case. There is an absolutely a pragmatic level that you can get to around your governance that still allows you to experiment and get some value, but whilst protecting potentially IP of an organization, protecting kind of reputation, and not having. I know it's very difficult for me to say when I had a slide that literally said who's to blame, but the idea that you want to remove a blame culture and actually want AI to provide value, and if you can understand why you're doing it, I think that why drives the level of governance that you then implement in your organization. We hear a lot as well around the idea of, well, perfect data in the GIGO example, or the idea of perfect governance, so having everything in place in terms of your processes, principles, a shiny SharePoint which has got links to all of the documents that explain what's going on, and you have annual training of people so that they have to use it. But what's the risk of waiting for that perfect governance before you actually start experimenting with AI?
I mean, I think you outlined it almost on your first slide around that sort of the hold up of governance programs, right? Will delay that experimentation, and that can have quite some quite severe consequences if the market around you is moving quite fast, and other people are and competitors are getting that advantage. And I think in my head, I think of it a lot as the AI train has left the station, right? It's here to stay. AI is going to form a large part of how organizations operate going forward. And I think the sooner that we can kind of get to a point where we're able to get on that journey, it's just a matter of time, and not it's a when, not an if, right? I think everyone needs to kind of think about AI in that sense. So I think that's kind of the key risk to me, is like by delaying the kind of the experimentation, you're just delaying that time that you're going to have to actually experiment effectively, have that time to experiment and fail and figure things out in a way that is not under extreme pressure, is not under scrutiny from external observance and that kind of thing. So I think it's about kind of compacting that experimentation time to when it's absolutely necessary to kind of keep things moving forward, but actually having it at a time where you can truly experiment, right? It's a scientific process at the end of the day. We can actually fail, we can actually do some trial and error. Users have got time to really kind of experiment and play with those ideas. So I think that for me is kind of the biggest risk of kind of delaying everything until it's almost like we need to do this right now. We need to get the results that to enable that kind of benefit, without actually any time to think about how you're going to get there. I think we've got time for one more question, I guess, between ourselves, Andy, and then we'll kind of move on.
Yep.
I think we've talked a lot about I think we talked about a lot of different concepts today, really. And I think, from a data governance perspective, do you think this kind of changes the way that teams need to operate now that AI is what it is? There is so much drive for experimentation and kind of developing that momentum. Do you think there is a real drive to kind of change the way the data governance teams operate, or anything that might sort of affect the way they kind of go about governing their organizations?
That's a really good question, because I think that the role, it has to change, right? So I think historically, even from like a reputation perspective in an organization, the governance team are often seen as the bad guys. So they're seen as the people that are, they're the police, they're the traffic cops telling you to slow down and do things in a different way. But actually, I think that now it'll enable data governance professionals to act in a different way and act almost as advisors to the business. So rather than being there as a perceived blocker, actually the conversations can pivot a little bit. And instead of you saying, a data governance professional saying, no, you can't do that, the conversation can be more about, have you considered doing X, Y, and Z, and trying to change the way that people interact with a governance capability. I think the challenge that we see a lot when we're speaking to clients is that governance is immature in a lot of organizations. So I think the reality of the situation is that what we've talked about today shows that that shouldn't be an inhibitor. So the role of governance can be more of that, I guess, oversight, support with decision making, becoming a continuous touch point, as opposed to being a policy blocker or something that you only see at the end of a project or at the start of a project. It's more there to support you as you try and do things in a slightly different way. And every role in an organization is having to adapt at the moment. We're seeing that we're having to change the way that we work with our clients, and clients are changing the way that they're going to market to their customers. So this is just another example of that, and this is I guess an evolution of the role. But actually, I think if you're a data governance professional, I think it's actually really, really exciting in that you can now change the perception that you have within your organization from being, as I say, that police officer to being that advisor to helping guide better outputs for the organization.
Yeah, I love that. And I think definitely where we've seen it operate best is where that team is kind of integrating and continuously in the loop with the development or the experimentation team, and not, like you say, that sort of like you hit a wall at one single point in a project where it's your governance milestone. It's more of an ongoing process throughout. Yeah, I think that's really important. Thanks, Andy. So, I mean, we've got a few minutes to kind of cover off a few questions from the audience.
We
So,
have.
got kind of the QA panel up here. So, I mean, I've got the first one I'm going to go for because it's just a really nice kind of straight answer. So someone's asked, and John's asked kind of what is OCR? So that's optical character recognition. And that is a kind of a way of taking documents that are maybe scanned in, or if you've got images of certain kind of types of information that are inside of your data sets, you can then use OCR to then extract the text from those in a machine readable way, so that you can copy and paste that into documents, you can search against it. And as I say in the presentation, you can also use AI to kind of augment, enhance that, and get a very good level of clarity on your OCR. So any images, any scanned documents, you can use OCR to support.
Awesome.
Have you had a chance to look through any questions, Andy? Is there any
Yeah,
particularly
I'll pick one out as well. So, but by the way, there are a few questions in there, and appreciate we won't have time to go through, but I promise we will get back to everybody and answer everyone's questions. So rest assured we will get back to you. The one I picked out is from Donal, partly because it says great presentation, so it's a little pat on the back for you and I, Matt. But it's also saying about that practical sweet spot between and recognizing that healthy tension. I think that's a really, really good question. And what do people look out for? What are the flags to recognize when you're too governed and when you're not governed enough? For me, the biggest tell in an organization, as I say, is when you have to make a decision and what is influencing that decision process. And that's where governance comes into any conversation, right? So the whole purpose of governance is to drive changes in behavior. So if you implement a new policy that you want people not to do something or to do something in particular, you are driving a change in behavior. Now, the idea of putting governance in place for what we're talking about today around AI is that you want people to experiment and feel confident to experiment, but that they ask questions when they feel like there is potentially butting against a policy, or that the answer it's giving doesn't feel quite right. That's the sweet spot. So when your culture shifts and when people are starting to do things with AI, they are asking more pointed questions and considering the governance angle, as well as just potentially an output that they're provided with. Maybe they challenge the output that they get is a really good signal. When people get an answer from a Gen AI tool, they actually say, well, is that right? Is that appropriate in our context? I think that's where you know that you're in the sweet spot. Now, that's not to say you don't continue to develop your governance in the background, because I do think it's a continuous evolution. We're all learning more and more about AI. It's still a relatively new beast, and we are going to change the way that we all work. But the fact that you allow your business to drive innovation and you have the opportunity to improve, but also you're doing that with the comfort that you're not putting yourself at any kind of reputational risk, that's where you need to be trying to drive to. So that's a really good question. I will very, very quickly, and apologies for not answering questions, but marketing will kill Matt and I if we don't go over the final couple of slides. So One of the things we'd like to offer all of the attendees, both now and on the recording, is access to kind of a feasibility snapshot. And the purpose of that really is to look at where you're at the moment and what's realistic for you in terms of delivering value quickly from AI. And we can support you in generating what those use cases could look like and how you could then build out a program. So if that's of any interest to anybody on the call, please reach out to Matt or I or anyone in the marketing team here at Telefónica Tech. Would be delighted to work with you on some of your AI use cases. And then the final point is to talk about some of the upcoming webinars that we've got. So Matt, again, is being rolled out in front of people. So he'll be doing AI Buzzword Bingo with Steve O'Keen. That's on the 24th of March. So please feel free to register for that. And we've got a couple of other tech talks down the way around security and takeaways from FabCon in Atlanta. So again, thank you everyone for your time and attendance this morning. So apologies for running over by a minute. And yeah, if there's any follow-up questions or anything like that, feel free to get in touch. And I hope you found today useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.